Hello and welcome to Bridging the Gap, a video series where we explore collective research perspectives from indigenous peoples across the globe, the diaspora, and the African continent. I'm your host, Jay Whitebear, and today we are at MIT Lincoln Laboratory with Dr. Melissa Smith, an assistant group leader here in Advanced Materials and Microsystems. Melissa, thank you for coming. Would you like to introduce yourself?
As you indicated, I'm Melissa. I've been at the lab for 5 years in the same group, Advanced Materials and Microsystems. My research specialty, I'll say, is literal and figurative and nanotechnology. So that's exploring very tiny things or taking something that's very large and making it smaller.
Oh, wow.
So that's kind of where I spend my time.
What?
And I also work in the best division in the laboratory.
In the where?
The best division in the laboratory.
The best division in the
Division
laboratory.
8, Division Great, yeah.
I think some people may have like a debate about that. So I'm interested in nanotechnology, and like this is your dissertation work, yes?
For the most part, nanotechnology, semiconductor materials and devices.
So for a lot of people out there maybe who are not familiar with this kind of topic, can you give us a little background about what your research focused on and what you were most interested in?
Broadly, for my PhD thesis, it was about using semiconductor materials in kind of, we'll say, non-traditional format. Mm-hmm. So the semiconductor materials and devices everyone is most familiar with, and I will say everyone, and I do mean everyone, is the materials and devices that are in our cell phones and computers everywhere all around us.
Right.
Those are all kind of the traditional semiconductor materials and devices. You got your Jack Kilbys, you got your John Bardines, you got those guys. So in grad school, what I spent my time doing was taking the same kind of devices, but recasting them in a whole different material set that will allow different types of functional electronics, for example. Oh. So if I can change the fundamental nature of the semiconductor material, maybe I can put it over a large area and make it into a device that's flexible, but you have to change the semiconductor material.
This is true.
So that in large is what I was doing in grad school. Same kind of space or development, but just different material set. And I would say that's kind of the core of all the technical work I've been doing. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking those, still in the semiconductor materials space in that land in nanotechnology. But instead of building transistors, I'm mostly saying, okay, we have all this infrastructure to build very small devices. Mm-hmm. And I hope everyone can appreciate what that's done for the field of computation.
Yes.
So the idea is to take those same tool sets, materials, designs, fabrication approaches, and apply that to a whole new field. So if you can imagine what's done to computation, imagine what it could do for aerospace, or bioengineering, or energy. So foundational skill set, materials, whole new fields I'm trying to look into now.
Innovative. Like, I have not read your dissertation, but I think I should now.
Okay. Don't read my dissertation. It's great. You should read it. It's amazing. It's the best one.
What motivated you to get into that field in particular? Like, were you a materials engineer in undergraduate?
Yes.
Or?
So I've always wanted to be an engineer, so that was just a thing.
Oh.
So like facts. And when I was kind of looking at different majors, I was trying to find one that would let me do everything, that wouldn't commit me to a particular industry. So there's only, in my opinion, there's only a handful of those, and materials science and engineering is one of them because materials are everywhere. Like, yes. You're sitting on a material.
I am sitting on a material.
You're wearing materials. So I figured if I gain expertise and familiarity in materials, I could just do whatever I want and work wherever I want. And if you kind of look over my work history, specifically a lot of the summer internships I've had, mm-hmm. I worked at John Deere, I worked at 3M, I worked at Xerox, worked at IBM, all very different fields and industries, but just with that expertise in materials allowed me to kind of move through different industries and be very effective. And I would say I settled in on semiconductors and nanotechnology because I thought ceramics and metals were kind of boring. They're not boring, but I wasn't as excited. Biomaterials, at the time I was squeamish, so it was the idea. I was like, can't hang. Now I like to think I could do a little bit better. Still a little
DNA
squeamish.
computation.
Yeah, so computation now is a big. That's a very large one that's budding. I'm not computationally inclined yet to be a good computational materials person. So then that left polymers and semiconductors, both of which, if you think about it, in the last century, the 20th century, are new materials. Plastics are new.
Yes.
And semiconductors are a thing that are up and coming. So I kind of just radiated towards the kind of newer materials, for lack of better term. And then I just thought semiconductors were fun. I liked the kind of tied to electronics and things of that sort.
That's true. And the Lincoln Laboratory also kind of specializes in that space as well, right? Like they had a lot of early innovation where they actually split off and went to Silicon Valley at some
Yes.
point. Yeah, okay. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Is that what kind of motivated you to come to the Lincoln Labs, or did you have...
No, me coming to Lincoln Laboratory was my mother's idea. I was working. My mother's not a technical person, so at all. Like she does counseling, mental health and substance abuse counseling. So I was at IBM working in their microelectronics division, and the company was in the process of spinning out that division to another company, and I didn't. The uncertainty kind of bothered me, and it was early in my career, so I wanted to be something more stable to fortify as I built a career. And I was looking all over the place, just everywhere. And my mom, I think I might still have it, where she sent me this email that I should go apply to Lincoln Laboratory. And she had this really in-depth technical explanations for all the different stuff I could do at Lincoln Laboratory. Like she was talking about semiconductor devices and I was like, who are you right now? Like you don't.
I was like, this is where I really need you to be.
I was just like, what are you saying? You don't know this stuff, right? But she just wouldn't let it go. I guess if she went and read all of the Wikipedia pages about nanotechnology only to convince me to look at Lincoln Laboratory, I was like, maybe it's worth it. My mom.
See what's going on.
I interviewed. I really, really enjoyed it. I was very fortunate to get an opportunity to work as a technical staff. And then it's been a blast. Again, Division 8, Division Great, it's been an absolute blast. And then just recently, I was promoted from technical staff to assistant group leader.
Wow, how are you finding that transition? Like, how you enjoy that kind of shift and focus a little bit?
I don't know. I started the position about 2 weeks before Massachusetts went remote.
Yes.
So in my head, everything's weird, but I don't know if that's because it's a new physician or just because the world is weird. So far, I would say I'm not freaked out, or I guess I'm doing okay. I don't have any real complaints aside from preferring to be at work to do things than having to do it remotely. But I think that's kind of where everyone's at.
Yeah, remote work is, I think everybody's at the point where they're getting like, how do we escape?
Yeah.
But so you talked about your mom a little bit, and I think you mentioned a little bit about being from Illinois earlier.
I am indeed.
Illinois or Illinois?
Illinois.
Illinois? Okay.
Illinois.
I'm gonna go with Illinois. I used to be in Chicago when I was a kid, so. So tell us a little bit about your story, like from young, like how did you get into this space, and kind of how do you identify in this space? And obviously I think you are a she, her, your pronouns, but as far as how you identify your identity in terms of racial or ethnic background?
So I would say I'm black, and I'll leave it as
Classic black?
Just black, regular, standard black.
That was classic, that's what.
Yeah, just classic, standard. The regular, no. So I mean, I grew up in Illinois, and I would say in terms of me, I always was interested in how things worked. That was just something that was always there. I remember distinctly being aware of how I was like technically inclined. I was like 2 or 3, and my dad had bought these Legos for my brother, and my brother just didn't care. He just couldn't care less. He's like 2 years old. He just didn't care. But I wanted to play with them so bad. Like I was like, I like I just, really young, wanting just to understand how put things together and how things worked. And I think, to like my dad's credit, is he didn't at any point discourage that. Maybe he just wanted someone to play with the toys he bought, right? But all along the way, my dad was extremely supportive of buying me all the little like erector sets or Legos. He was like, "Daughter wants it. Okay, fine. This is probably it's probably a good idea that she's doing this. This is not a bad thing." So, I think that maybe that's kind of unique in my story, is that to have my father and my mother be just overwhelmingly supportive. At no point did they think it was weird that I was, or maybe they did think it was weird, but they were okay with it. They were like, "It's fine. This is harmless." So I think that's kind of a unique story, and I think it's to drive home the uniqueness. Okay, my mother, she's not technically inclined, and my father, to a large extent, isn't either. So they were not engineers or scientists in their profession. So this is a field I'm demonstrating an interest in, and they're all for it. They're like, "We think we know what's going on. We think we like it. She's she's helping out. She's not hurting herself." So I think that's kind of like that was really important for me, just to have the unbridled like support from my parents to kind of go along this route without hesitation.
No, that is I think not always the case, especially when it comes to like, different identities in engineering in the field.
Absolutely.
So, did you have that same experience like once you got to the graduate and undergraduate level? I mean, I think as women in science, as women of color in science, sometimes the perspectives and the actual experience is a little different. I mean,
yeah. So I would say I got that same level of support from key people when it mattered. So there were some, I would say, starting in high school, my peers would make statements about it being weird that I was in math and science, or that I was unqualified to go to University of Illinois. Like I was just, yeah. But for every, let's say, peer who would make that statement, my high school teachers would say like, "No, this is you. This is where you need to be. This is it." And that was the case for my high school teachers, and then my professors that knew me in undergrad. They were like, "No, this is you. This is what it is." So anytime my peers would say something that was a little bit off, there would always be some greater authority that would kind of correct everything, which was good for me psychologically, because it was good to hear the people who had the power think so highly of me, or think of me to be capable. So then those are the things that kind of motivated me through and got me through more challenging times.
Wow. Yeah, that's so inspiring. Like I think that people came in and like actually supported you along the way.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes we hear not so positive stories
Absolutely.
coming out of these spaces.
Absolutely.
So like just to see that kind of experience exists is just like,
Yeah.
that's just, I love it. So I guess we talked a little bit about your research and a little bit about your background and kind of what your motivations are in the space. So like when you think about your research and where you're going in the future, how do you envision that path for yourself and maybe for others collectively, like in your cohort, things of that nature?
So I would say like I don't know if other Black individuals feel this way. Just for me, I feel like there's this tension where I have a technical direction that I want to go to and be good at that, hang out with, be in the same rubbing shoulders with John Bardeen and Jack Kilby, on that level. But as I'm getting more experience and maturing in this space, I'm starting to acknowledge the importance of having Black faces in more powerful positions. And there's an example of, let's say if I was a white person, I may not be a group leader so much at this point, because I would have made, it's like, it doesn't matter. I want to stay in technical land. I want to keep doing the papers and patenting and, all that sort of thing. But I think for the Black community at large, it's important to have people that look like them, like me, in positions of power. I'll show an example. When I was at IBM, and then we would on occasion go out, like do community outreach to high schools in the area. So this one guy, his name is Rick, he's like, Melissa, we're going to Jersey. We're going to go talk to some high school students. And I'm like, let's do it, right? And it was like a largely black and Latin high school. So we go there. And I'm, just like, we're in high school. These people are going to make fun of me. They're going to call me a nerd. I was like, man. I was like, all right, if there's one person in the room that finds me valuable, I didn't know why I was there. Like, why? Like, okay. And I remember there was this group of, I don't know, like 5 or 6 black girls, girls, in the back, in the back of the class. And they were all staring at me. I'm like, they're going to make fun of me.
What?
They're going to make fun of me. So I was like, okay, that's fine. So I remember there was a time we were supposed to go disperse and talk to all the students. I was like, I'll go give them something to make fun of. So I go back there to like talk to them. It's like, so what's going on? And they were just kind of staring at me, and I was like, so, like, what are they gonna do? And one of them looked at me and said, really? I can be a technical person? Like, I can be an engineer and scientist? I'm like, of course you can. It's like, I've just never seen it before. I didn't know black women could do this. I just never had it in my head that this was an option for me. She was this girl was like, I always wanted to be an astronaut. Ever since I was really, really young, I just never saw anyone like me being an astronaut, so I just thought I couldn't do it. And that was very powerful for me because it's obviously something I ignored when I was growing up, but I'm beginning to understand how powerful it is to have a role model or some example of somebody in a particular position for certain students. If you think about white men or Asian men, they have examples everywhere of what powerful, influential engineers and scientists look like. And in terms of black people, we're there. It's just less of us. So I'm learning kind of the onus is on me is to kind of be more out front to say, hey, yes, you can be a black woman and
be interested in science.
And it's okay, it's doable. So that's kind of the tension I was talking about, where if I wasn't a black woman, I would just kind of sit and do my technical thing, but I'm appreciating that there's this other thing that needs to be addressed. Because in my head, if you have somebody who wanted to be an astronaut their whole life, they were probably going to be a pretty good astronaut. But if they never got an opportunity or never pursued it because they
didn't even know it was an option.
I feel like, okay, the United States has missed out on a really good astronaut.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of...
No, I think that's an important point. I think that's part of like why I'm doing this as well, is that we get visibility. We get people saying, I see myself in these different narratives. And I think that's something that, like you said, it's not as prevalent as it could be or maybe even should be. So did you experience that like growing up? Like in your community, was it predominantly one ethnic group or one race? Or?
I mean, it was mostly white.
Okay.
Right.
So there wasn't a lot of diverse perspectives when you were a child either. You just chose engineer.
Yeah, it's like maybe that's what's different about. I don't think I'm that different from the average black woman, but maybe that's one tiny thing that might be different, is that I didn't see the lack of role models as an issue. For some reason, that was supposed to dissuade me. It didn't. Like, I just was like, here we go. No. I guess I'm gonna be the only one in the room. Okay, I'm okay with that. Is everybody else okay? I'm fine.
This is the only one in the room that's never affected you?
I would say I don't walk around knowing or feeling like I'm black until someone reminds me. So I'm gonna walk in the room, I'm gonna do my thing. If the record scratches and everyone stops to stare at me, I was like, oh, that's why, So that's kind of how I view it, I'm pretty sure the world, how it looks to me, is the same as for everybody else. It's only when you call out that I'm different is when it gets weird.
Someone did that. You're making us weird right now.
Yeah, I was like, it was fine.
No, I think that's interesting. Like, I think it's important to have different perspectives on that. I think some of us can get tunnel vision sometimes when we're in one place and you're alone and you don't have someone else to say, hey, like, what's your experience? And like, how do you interact in these spaces?
I would say, like, in terms of interacting in the spaces, what I've learned is that we're like everyone on the planet. We're all so similar. It's really, I don't think there's a good reason to get worked up over something like that. When I remember when I was interning when I was younger, I started interning when I was younger. I was like, 19, 20-year-old black woman interning at an engineering company with, 50-year-old white guys, right? And you would think we wouldn't get along, but what one particular individual we bonded over was music.
Oh.
He really liked early 90s like R&B.
Okay.
No, I'm serious. This guy's in his 40s or 50s.
I
really.
think it's good music. Everyone likes
Right.
it.
So then we started at the time CDs. We would like go to work and exchange CDs because we like the same music. And it's kind of like if I hadn't let myself open to that interaction and say, okay, sure, looks completely different from me, but we have the same playlist, right? So I guess in those scenarios, if someone's feeling uncomfortable, if you can at least be open enough to look at someone as an individual, not just a white guy or an Asian guy, and say, okay, what do we have in common? Because chances are, if at Lincoln Laboratory, you have something in common, or if you're at the same company, there's a common interest that brought you there. So I would say if there's a struggle there with feeling like you're the only one in the room, keep in mind there is something that everyone can relate to anyone on some level. There's some commonality.
Oh wow. Oh,
And if it's really fun to find where that commonality is. It makes,
go looking for like dissecting.
yeah, like how are we similar?
That's interesting. R&B.
I wouldn't have guessed that,
No,
but
it sells a lot of like records, right? Like people buy it, people listen to it, so why not? So I guess that brings us to like the last kind of section, like where we talk about global perspectives and how, as researchers, we have or have not interacted with scientific perspectives outside of like Western kind of areas, or how those researchers are kind of impacted by the dominance of Western culture in science. So I'm wondering, have you ever had any interactions along kind of those frontiers?
well, I don't know if this counts. You tell me if it doesn't count.
Okay.
My research advisor for grad school, he was Nigerian. And
There's more though. There's more though, right?
well, I don't know if there's more. Like, is that bad?
No.
On occasion, when you bring up the topic, I did see kind of an underlying activity of his was to make sure like individuals in, let's say, Nigeria had resources, comparable resources to what we had at MIT. So it might be something like an exchange student would show up. Maybe there's a better term for that. A visiting scholar. A visiting scholar would show up, and they'd hang out in the lab from a university that I'd never heard of. Or we would, when we were refreshing equipment, maybe some of that would get donated or bequeathed with the blessings of the group to different lab spaces at universities in Africa. So that was kind of the first time I thought it was weird, because I was thinking, why do they want what we have? They have it. Like, why do they need us to help them do? But now that I reflect on it, I'm kind of thinking that there was something there with that.
So kind of that relationship between like your grad advisor and kind of his connection back to the continent, things like that. I think, have you ever interacted with other researchers outside of that place, like maybe co-authored a paper or things like that?
No. And I would say that might be the nature of the field I work in, because nanotechnology
Fabrication
is very expensive, and it's also it's up there. So there's very few countries in the world that actually have the facilities and capability, one, to build it, but then sustain it. You need to be a dominant player in those markets in order to sustain it, and that's just to play, right? So it's kind of like if said, this is just me speculating, but if said area or country or whatever wasn't part of the rise in the mid 20th century, burning cash and all these sorts of things, you kind of miss the boat. So there's going to be like a giant leap to catch up to where things were. So that's just kind of how I view it. I could be wrong.
Okay, so we were talking about kind of collaborations with the African continent and kind of your perspective on like their entry, for developing nations in particular, their entry into nanotechnology being a very high bar for manufacturing. So do you think those kinds of collaborations are important in balancing out the Western perspective, or do you think that, what kind of relationship do you think that should be?
So I think in the case of nanotechnology, as I'm generalizing, if you're a good engineer, if you understand the principles of math, science, and engineering, you can be productive and effective and fruitful in the space of nanotechnology. So I don't think from a capability or experiential standpoint there's any barriers. Any flavor of any technical person can be really effective in that space. Even someone who does computational stuff. Like deterministic between probability.
Computation people.
It's true. It's true. So I think keeping that in mind, that anyone who's like good technically can be effective in that space. I think would be a value of getting a different perspective on how to use technology.
Right.
I think in maybe Western iterations of nanotechnology are very myopic in terms of kind of focusing on one thing, and maybe there's some obvious use for this technology that we just in the Western culture haven't honed in on because we haven't had a particular problem, right?
Right. Yeah, counted
so I think that's where things could be fruitful, knowing that someone's good technically from wherever, and then immersing them in experience, and maybe that's again a visiting scholar, stuff like that. Getting that expertise in place, then it might be really obvious how to then further interact back and forth. Yeah.
I see. So if you could like design an ideal collaboration, that's a scary question. What would your ideal collaboration be? Would it be more like, so Lincoln is going to be the FFRDC, and then we have industry, and then we have global perspectives and global industry and global FFRDCs, I'm assuming. What would an ideal collaboration be like to have like a very collective research focus?
I would say what I've always felt just in the nanotechnology space in the Western culture, you can always use more hands. You can always use more people that just are good at technically and can get stuff done. So I would envision that you have brilliant scholars coming from other places, do a rotation from the U.S. to South Korea to Taiwan to China to Germany, to see all the major microfabrication hubs and understand how the technology works, understand what is necessary in order to support the development of technology in this space, and with that knowledge then go back to their home and then think about how to leverage that technology. That's, I think, how that would work in my head. I think some very interesting applications and potentially innovations could come from that once there's an understanding of what the technology is capable of and how to implement it effectively. That's like a boring answer.
Well, maybe I'll take nanotechnology now.
You could. I could use some help over in.
Wait, he was great, right?
I could use some help over in e-building if you really want.
So I think those are kind of most of the questions that we were looking at today, and so I want to kind of give you a chance to say whatever you want to the audience. Something good, hopefully, but bad is okay. Less positive is also okay, but kind of address some of the things that you see as key points of this space or any other space that you're interested in.
I would just say, I truly believe that there's incredible talent dispersed everywhere, every part of the world. So we should be mindful of that and make efforts to tap into it. again, it goes back to the woman in high school who was talking about being an astronaut and just never having the understanding of how to get there. Those individuals who already have that innate passion for something, we definitely want to include them in order so they can reach their potential, which will be a benefit for everybody.
Thank you for being here, Dr.
Thank you.
Melissa Smith.
This was fun.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. For those watching, if you have a researcher you'd like to see on the series, please let us know, and thank you for joining us again today.